It's Shepherds of the Sea, and it's a book basically about destroyer escorts in World War II and the men who sailed them. And destroyer escorts actually ended up being the most important, successful, and valuable anti-submarine vessel in the United States fleet during World War II. They're credited with sinking some 70 U-boats, 26 Japanese submarines, and they fought in every major battle in the Pacific theater. So they were a very significant force in World War II. And what's even more remarkable to me is the people who were manning those boats. These were mostly teenagers with little or no experience on the water. In fact, some of them told me that the only thing they knew about boats is that the pointed end went first. So they were a remarkable group of teenagers. They were very courageous, and they were being led by their skippers, and their skippers were Ivy League college boys who were, basically naval reserve, and they were more used to being aboard yachts than warships. They were sent out on these novel vessels, destroyer escorts, which were brand new and had never been tested before. The original idea was Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. He recommended that these vessels be built to deal with the continuing presence of the Nazi U-boats in World War II on the North Atlantic. And Winston Churchill warned Roosevelt and America that basically something had to be done to stop Hitler's U-boats in the war before, as he said it, the sea would become America's cage, cutting off all commerce between the United States, England, and Europe. And so the president ordered them built in 1940, but the Navy decided that that was probably not a good idea, so they convinced the president that the scarce resources that were available at that time would be better spent on destroyers. And I think that if you look at the historical record, you'll see that that probably was a mistake. The destroyer escort is sort of a novel type of vessel. It's smaller than a destroyer, around 300 feet, and it had a shorter turning radius so that it could essentially turn on a dime compared to a destroyer. So what they did is they escorted the convoys across the Atlantic, and the convoys consisted of troop ships and supply ships for the war effort. But if they made contact with a U-boat, they could break off and then they could pursue that U-boat. When you look at the record, though, 70 U-boats, they probably were, without question, the most successful anti-submarine vessel in the fleet. This ship is the USS Slater. It was built in the Tampa shipyard. There were 563 destroyer escorts built in 17 shipyards all across the country. It actually came late in the game, like a lot of them. This is 1944. They did a few escorts back and forth across the Atlantic. And one interesting thing that the Slater did do, the only Nazi submarine, the only U-boat captured by the Americans in World War II was captured by destroyer escorts. They got a treasure trove of material, confidential documents, actually half a ton from this U-boat U-505, and one of the torpedoes was actually loaded onto the Slater and brought back to America for study, along with the all-important Enigma machine. And that was the code-breaking machine, and it actually was very useful because it came on the eve of the Normandy invasion, and they were able to actually take that off the U-505, bring it back to America, and was very helpful in breaking the German codes. One of the sailors who was going through this U-boat, now most of these sailors had never been aboard a submarine at all, let alone a German U-boat. So they were storming through, looking for, and meanwhile the U-boat is flooding, because before the Germans went overboard, they opened up the valves so they could flood this, because they certainly didn't want the Americans to get any of the materials and the confidential documents that they did in fact end up getting. So he's running through the passageways, and he goes into the captain's quarters, and he rips open the captain's desk, and he finds a Mont Blanc pen, And he thought, well, this is kind of a nice treasure. I'll take this home. Because if you found something, because this was a top secret operation, you were not allowed to keep any of it. But he kept this anyway. So he kept the pen. He brought it home. Years later, it ran out of ink. So he contacted the Mont Blanc company and said, you know, would you have a refill for this pen? And he told them how old it was. And they said, no, I'm sorry, we don't have any refills for that pen. And they said, where did you get it? And he said, I got it off U505. And they said, well, if you send that pen to us, we'll send you a brand new Mont Blanc pen, which he didn't do. He donated it to U505, which is now a museum. I interviewed 91 sailors and officers from 56 different ships, so that's about 1/10 of the fleet. And I could have done a lot more, but at some point you had to stop because you never get your book written. So an interesting thing about that was interesting to me is how patriotic the young men were back in those days. After Pearl Harbor, everyone wanted to join up. Everyone wanted to be in the military. So they would lie about their age, they would forge birth certificates, they would do a variety of things just to get into the military. And this one sailor from New Jersey wanted very badly to get into the military after Pearl Harbor. So his problem was, though, he had very bad eyes. And he knew at that point he couldn't pass any of the tests that would allow him to enter any of the branches of the service. So he was also a very avid reader, and he read popular science. And he noticed, in addition to popular science, that there was this experimental program called Invisible Eyes. And it was a program that was sort of a precursor to the contact lenses. And so he got on the train, went into New York, got enrolled in the program, and got his set of invisible eyes. So he went to the recruiting station and watched how they did the examination. Well, he watched the Navy, and the Navy had one line. So you would go down the line and you would get your physical exam, you'd get your psychological exam, and then your eye exam. Well, he said he knew he couldn't get in that line. So then he watched the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had two lines. The first one was for your physical exam and then your psychological exam, and then if you passed that, they told you to go get in the other line. It's for your eye exam. So he figured that would give him just enough time to slip the contact lenses in his eyes, which he did. And the recruiter said, read the bottom line. And he said, how far down? And he said, as far as you can read. And so this sailor read P-A-T. And he said, what are you reading? He said, I'm reading the bottom line. And he said, you're reading patent pending. So he said, you clearly have eyes of an eagle, so you can, you're in. So that, and that was just how so many people, so many of the sailors that I interviewed, and they did it because of patriotism, they did it because it was the right thing to do. And we sent them to sea in these new and untested vessels that the Navy thought initially was a colossal waste of money. No warship had ever been manned by an African-American crew. And the first warship to be manned by an African-American crew was USS Mason, which was a destroyer escort. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to do something to end racial discrimination in the military and in the industry. And of course, he was a pragmatist, and he was also a shrewd politician, and he knew he had to be very careful. Otherwise, he'd alienate some of the Southern political folks that just didn't have that same view. Eleanor Roosevelt, on the other hand, was a very strong proponent of equal rights and of doing something to end racial discrimination. So she continually prodded Franklin Roosevelt to do something, so he decided that he would have one of these new destroyer escorts be manned by an African-American crew. It had white officers, but an African-American crew. They went off in the Battle of the Atlantic, did some heroic things, and in fact, they were recommended, the crew was recommended for a Navy commendation by their white captain. Well, the Navy didn't want these people in the first place, and so they decided they weren't going to give them the commendation. So the commendation was not given to the surviving crew members until almost 50 years later. President Clinton actually was the person that gave them the award. If you look at this ship and you think about it, you think over 200 people in a space of 35 feet wide and 200 feet long, 300 feet long. It's pretty tight accommodations, and if you look here in the bunk room, you'll see that there really aren't enough bunks for all the people. So you know, it was a tough situation, especially they would be out on the water for months at a time. And they were smaller ships. So on the North Atlantic, it could be a very difficult situation out there. I have some photographs that show the ships actually completely ice encrusted, and they would just, you know, move around on the water with great difficulty, but they survived. After the war, you know, some of them were scrapped. And some of them were given to other countries as part of President Truman's the Truman Doctrine, which you know was to provide these type of vessels and other military aid to other countries. So this particular vessel went to Greece, and it was their #1 vessel for a long time, and until about 1991, when the Greek government decided they no longer needed this vessel. Within a very short period of time, the Destroyer Escort Sailors Association raised nearly $300,000 to have it towed back to America. It was housed for a short time at the Intrepid Air Sea Space Museum in New York City. When they no longer had room for it, they had to search for a new home. And fortunately, Mayor Jennings, who's the mayor of the city here in Albany, felt this would be a wonderful attraction on the waterfront, which he was trying to revitalize at the time. And now it's the only destroyer escort still afloat in America in its original World War II configuration. This is the kind of thing that allows people to see what it was like back then, why there was World War II and what happened, and how valiant the sailors were who served aboard these vessels. It's a remarkable testimony, I think, to the bravery of the men back in those days.